So to kick things off, your lab, as far as I understood, combines AI and neuroscience, and it probably brings a lot of like different people from different backgrounds, like psychologists and medical doctors, and maybe like people who are like physicists or like people who have like computer science degrees. And is it like ever challenging to get people from such different backgrounds to like speak the same language and communicate with each other properly and do all those things?
Yes, it's most of the time it's exciting and also nice. And therefore, to be frank, I actually like this topic so much, this new topic on AI and how we can use AI to understand the brain, but although we start now looking at how AI changes human behavior, because lots of people are interacting with AI. So we look at how AI changes human behavior, our social processes, and in turn also the brain, and maybe then even the entire society. Because if it changes each person a bit, and 90 million people are interacting with AI every day, if it changes all of these persons a mini bit, it will later spiral out and it will change our brains and our behavior. Therefore, I find it quite interesting from both sides. And I love this topic although so much because over the last 4 or 5 years we have developed this topic, and that, as you say, that allowed us to work with very different people together. And meanwhile, I've been working in traditional human neuroscience and also in clinical neuroscience. And there we already work together very strongly, for instance, with medical doctors or with hospitals, because although we want to bring our new treatments to patients and want to understand how emotions dysregulate in patients, and also with computer science, because we use these methods for analyzing the data. And now I find over the last years, I've been interacting more and more with areas that were not so much related to us, including sociology or law or philosophy or although AI researchers, because everyone is now basically interested in how can we use this new technology for science? And on the other hand, how will this new technology change our daily life? Therefore, I find this still very interesting. On the other hand, you said an important point. It's sometimes then interesting to see you put then four people at a table and all are interested in the same topic, but all have different perspectives on this. And for these discussions, it's very exciting and it's very interesting. But as you already said, a bit in daily life, when it comes to running studies or doing projects, sometimes a bit challenging because people have different perspective or people have different, sometimes a very different thinking background. But until now, we always manage to get everyone together, and I think it's quite interesting, and it's also very important for myself. So I learned quite a lot of this because I'm also aware that I have somehow from my training and from my perspective and opinion a relatively clear view on the things. But it's then quite interesting to see that other people look at the same thing and have a different view. And so it also helps me to develop myself and also change my working style sometimes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And speaking of technology and AI, today, like so many people spend so much hours and so much of their time in their day to talk to AI assistants and chatbots. So, like from a neuroscience perspective, do you think our brains are starting to treat AI like real people and real humans?
Yes, I think so. Because we although I wrote two reviews on this or two perspectives, what I think is that this is what we now observe is a fundamental change, how humans interact with technology. Before, and AI was around like 5 or 10 years at least. So we use it for analyzing data. My colleagues develop AI to analyze pictures and so on, or for visual processing. But suddenly it's everywhere. So my 5-year-old daughter can now work with AI. My mom works with, sometimes ask AI for advice. And that's quite interesting to see because it fundamentally changed because we now can communicate with AI just via speaking or via communication. And it gives us a feeling that there is something that listens to us, that gives us good advice, and that understands us. And I think this very deeply interacts with the human brain circuits because the human brain has been developed 100,000 of years ago when people lived in small groups in the Stone Ages, or maybe even before. And what made us humans so successful is not that we are the strongest or that we are the fastest or that we don't have the biggest teeth. We are maybe a bit more intelligent than monkeys, but maybe also not so much more intelligent. But what made us humans so successful is that we can work together. And this is what we experience in everyday life. We have a very social brain. And as soon as we come in a room, we try to understand other people. We are social comparison. We see whom we can trust, whom we don't trust, whom we like, whom we don't like. And all of these are automatic social computations that our brain performs. And now suddenly these same processes are triggered by a technology, which also can interact with us like it is a real, maybe social being. And so from this aspect, I think that humans treat AI maybe inherently already a bit like a social interaction partner, and probably with the better development of the technology, plus humans get more and more used to this, it will be probably become more and more like a social partner.
Yeah. Following up on that, if like a student or a person spends a lot of time talking to AI every day and they give them like AI gives us like perfectly polite answers, I'm like really interested if it could make it harder for us humans to interact with each other after like handling AI every day.
Actually, that is a very interesting question. I I don't know if there are studies on this. As far as I know, probably not. This is a very interesting observation that I would also find very interesting because often AI has this syncophacy, so it tries to please the user and cover the user. But often in real life, the things that make us grow or that are important for us to change are probably more advice or feedback that we don't want to hear. That's maybe not so nice or where we sometimes struggle a bit. But in the long run, this is probably very important to also have some differences to grow with differences.
Mm. I also know that your lab really focuses on how to use AI as a solution for like mental health problems. And for students like who aren't experts yet and will be watching it, like we really want to know how like does your lab use AI to read or decode like our brains, a brain scan.
Yeah. So, yeah. So we have done quite a number of studies over the last years where we still mostly use AI related methods. So we are doing this for a couple of years and we have very good experience with machine learning. So for instance, support vector machines. And we are now although more and more analyzing this AI, so with full CNN models, for instance. And there, the key challenge that we had when we started this a couple of years ago was that there was no good measure of subjective experience. So it's relatively straightforward to measure, for instance, cognition or memory in the brain. And because for memory, you can measure right or wrong. So a person remembers or a person doesn't remember. Then you can look at the brain activity that maybe differs. But emotional experience are often very subjective. So, and they are maybe very different between participants, between people. So for instance, I don't know, one person is, if you show different pictures in the MRI scanner, one person is afraid of a wolf and the other is not afraid of a wolf or something like that. And so, and it's very much influenced by our personality and also our experiences, our past. So it was very challenging to find a traditional method that can give us a good brain model about how does a person feel right now. And there we realized we need better methods and we need maybe more naturalistic paradigms. And for the more advanced methods, we then used more and more machine learning and now AI because it can analyze the brain patterns more precisely and can give us a good measure about what does a person feel right now. And the second thing that we also optimized in the last years is to have more naturalistic paradigms. That means in the standard studies on fear, for instance, a person is in the scanner or gets an EEG system on, and then then scientists show them pictures. So one picture after each other. You can imagine like a picture of a snake. 2 seconds later comes a picture of a dog. 4 seconds later, there's a picture of a fire or something like that. And this is traditionally used for measuring fear in the scanner, or although in lots of experiments. However, if we think about daily life, then fear is totally different. There is not just one picture that comes and then it goes away, but it's a dynamic process. So often it's more, imagine, I don't know, a slightly scary situation. You are alone late at night in a subway, for instance. Then a group of people comes in and you look at them and you see, oh, they look a bit strange. Maybe they come nearer and then they go further away. And then you suddenly realize, oh, these are actually the people working here or something like that. And then we see that fear is much more dynamic. So because you interpret the situation and then fear goes up and then they come nearer, fear goes up more and then suddenly it goes down. And this shows that if we just show simple pictures, it's probably not like measuring fear in everyday life. So therefore, we now, when people are in the scanner, we, for instance, show them parts of a horror movie to induce fear, or we ask them to remember their most romantic event to induce positive emotions. And with this combination of new technology plus more realistic emotional experience, we hope we find a better way to measure emotions.
Okay. And also, as far as I know, you also work with neurofeedback where people can actually see their own brain activity on screen or real time. And what do you think, like, how does simply looking at your own brain help a person, like, learn, for example, control their severe anxiety?
Yeah, I think so. I did this. We set this up, or we did our first experiments with this in 2016, 2017. So it's 10 years ago, meanwhile. And I still remember I was with a colleague. We were setting up this platform, this neurofeedback platform, where we can analyze the data in real time, and then you can see this. You can see your own brain activity basically in real time. And I had seen some studies on this, but I actually didn't really believe that this can work, to be frank. But then I was the first participant in the scanner myself, and we tried the new brain system. And actually, it's somehow possible to, within 20, 30 minutes, to learn control over your brain activity. And this was very surprising for me, because this means that the brain is a bit like a muscle. So we can, for instance, we can learn new motions with our hand, like playing a piano, because we have feedback. So we can see our hand or we feel our fingers. And then we can learn to play a specific kind of sequence on the piano. For the brain, usually we are lacking this feedback. So I don't know which part of my brain now is most active, or I don't know which part of my brain is right now most engaged, because I don't have a feedback signal. I can't see it and I can't feel it. But if we then measure this and show it to participants, one can actually learn to control the brain, similar like a muscle. And we subsequently did a couple of studies on this, where we first showed people can learn to control their brain activity, although in very controlled studies with sham control and with 2 or 3 groups. And finally, with some colleagues in Germany, we did a study where we applied this to patients with PTSD. PTSD is a trauma-related disorder, that is, people who had a car accident or were exposed to a violent robbery or have been in war often have this fear disorder. It's basically a very high arousal. They experience these emotions or these situations again and again, and they feel very stressed. And for instance, with these patients, we also did a real-time neurofeedback study and could show that they can learn to control their prefrontal cortex, or the brain region that's in charge of emotion regulation. And even 4 or 6 weeks later, they had less anxiety symptoms than patients who didn't undergo this training. So I think in the end, the opportunities for real-time neurofeedback to decrease, for instance, anxiety or stress are quite good. The only problem currently is that it's often the standard approaches are an MRI. So this is a machine like you all have in the hospital, but it needs an own room. It's very expensive and it's a bit loud if you're laying in this machine. So it's not a very good environment for translation. Therefore, we now and lots of other people use other brain imaging technologies like FNIRS. FNIRS is something like a cap you can wear. This works with light and it can also measure your brain activity. Not as precise as fMRI, but it's still good enough to train the brain. And there we are currently running studies to see if this can also work. This could lead to systems that people can maybe even train at home.
Yeah, that sounds like very complicated and incredible technology. And like, I wanted to know if you look at both sides of your work, neuroscience and AI, like what is the biggest myth about neuroscience or AI that you wish general public would stop believing in?
Oh, there's quite a lots of myths, but I think one thing that I would really not like to emphasize, but that lots of people have to understand, is that although in scientific papers, so we have made a huge progress over the last 20 or 30 years in trying to understand the brain. And there we have lots of progress to try to understand how the brain processes emotion, how we read, how we write things, and how the brain computes specific things. But on the other hand, I think it's also important to be a bit humble and to acknowledge that we are still quite far away from understanding the brain. Because again, it's often, and I have this in my lecture, you read it in the internet, but it's still true that the brain is still the most complex system in the universe. And so trying to understand how humans feel and how humans behave and how humans think is a very complex challenge. And although we have all of this new technology, we have a huge amount of papers, we have always beautiful figures of the brain, how this is how the brain works. But actually, we are still at the beginning and probably learning every day. So I think if there is something like in a newspaper or in a documentary in the TV where then it's basically supposed we now cracked the brain, we understand how humans think and feel. I think from this we are quite far away still.
Thank you. And as a final question for our student community, we really want to know what originally sparked your curiosity to study the brain, or was there like a specific moment in your life that made you realize that this was what you wanted to do for your career?
That is a good question. So I think to be frank, I didn't fully plan this as career. I think I was mostly curious about how the brain works. Then one thing came to the other. But I think one key aspect that drove me is that I was working, my background is also a bit in mental health. I first wanted to study clinical psychology and also was working with patients. But I realized there that mental health disorders are very disruptive or very devastating. So mental health disorders like depression, anxiety, or the addiction are actually relatively common. So there are huge studies out there with different numbers, but maybe a good rule of thumb is maybe 1 in 8 people will develop the mental disorders over their life. And then I also worked with patients during this time, during an internship when I was still a student. And I realized no matter what we do, so, and this is the same for the best hospital in Germany, the best hospital in Hong Kong, the best hospital in mainland China, the best hospital in the US, no matter how good the doctors are, no matter how good the psychotherapists are, or the current treatments that we have, there's quite a number of patients we just can't help. It's maybe like 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 patients that don't become better. And so I think for this, it's also critical to understand how the brain works, in particular emotions, because emotions are a big, or emotional dysregulations are a big part of mental disorders or driver of mental disorders. And so I think, although from this aspect, it's very important to understand how the brain processes emotions, how we can regulate this with the final aim to help patients or also help healthy people to better control their emotions or better understand their emotions because they're just a big part of our daily life. And if they go wrong, it gets really very devastating or it causes lots of suffering and impairments.
Thank Thank you so much. Thank you so much for breaking down your studies and also how you realized that this was what you wanted to do for your career. And I also want to thank you for behalf of our student community because this is actually really incredibly valuable to us, and this helps us get into more in that field. And also thank you for doing your work at HKU because it definitely inspires a lot of young people on our channel to follow in your footsteps or do something related to neuroscience. So thank you so much for taking your time for this interview.
Thank you very much for the interview. I'm happy if that could help, and happy if we can inspire some young people. Yeah.